Chapter 1. A Pride of Atheists. Vox Dei, as every philosopher knows, cannot be trusted in science. Charles Darwin, in Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication. I don't care if you go to hell. God does, assuming he exists, or he wouldn't have bothered sending his son to save you from it. Jesus Christ does too, if you'll accept for the sake of argument that he went to all the trouble of incarnating as a man, dying on the cross, and being resurrected from the dead in order to hand you a get-out-of-hell-free card. Me? Not so much. I don't owe you. I don't owe you anything. While, as a Christian, I am called to share the good news with you, I can't force you to accept it. Horse, water, drink, and all that. So it's all on you. Your soul is not my responsibility. I am a Christian. I'm also a libertarian. I believe in free will and in allowing you to exercise it. I believe that our free will is a gift from our Creator, and that He expects us to use it. I believe in living and letting live. If you'll leave me alone, I'll be delighted to do you the courtesy of leaving you alone in return. I have no inherent problem with atheists or agnostics. I have no problem with Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Pastafarians, and I have no problem with the crazies who believe that humanity is the result of ancient alien breeding experiments. To be honest, I rather like the crazies. Their theories are usually the most entertaining of the lot. I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, and there's no reason why we shouldn't both be perfectly cool with that. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens are not so much cool with that. I'm not asking you to respect my beliefs. Why should you? Maybe you think I'm insane because I believe that Jesus is coming back one of these days. But does my insanity actually affect you in any material way? Is my religious madness really all that much more out there than my faith that the Minnesota Vikings will win the Super Bowl someday? Talk about the substance of things hoped for. Vegas will give you better odds on JC this year. As for your beliefs, I really don't care if you want to question God's existence or criticize the Pope or deny the Holocaust or declare that Jesus was an architect previous to his career as a prophet. Every member of humanity is at least a little bit crazy in his own special way. Some just happen to make it a little more obvious than others. Vox's first law: any sufficiently advanced intelligence is indistinguishable from insanity. All I ask, all the vast majority of the billions of people of faith on the planet ask, is to be left alone to believe what we choose to believe and live how we decide to live. But the unholy Trinity have no intention of leaving me alone. Richard Dawkins accuses me of child abuse because I teach my children that God loves them even more than I do. Sam Harris declares that I should not be tolerated and suggests that it might be ethical to kill me in preemptive self-defense. Christopher Hitchens asserts that I am a form of human Drano, poisoning everything I encounter. A fourth new atheist, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, is less judgmental, but even he, bless his heart, wants to save me from myself. And now we have a problem. That's why I'm writing this book. I'm not trying to convince you that God exists. I'm not trying to convince you to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. I'm not even trying to convince you that religious people aren't lunatics with low IQs who should be regarded with pity and contempt. But I am confident that I will convince you that this trio of new atheists, this unholy Trinity, are a collection of faux intellectual frauds utilizing pseudo-scientific sleight of hand in order to falsely claim that religious faith is inherently dangerous and has no place in the modern world. I am saying that they are wrong. They are reliably, verifiably, and factually incorrect. Richard Dawkins is wrong. Daniel C. Dennett is wrong. Christopher Hitchens is drunk, and he's wrong. Michael Onfray is French, and he's wrong. Sam Harris is so superlatively wrong that it will require the development of esoteric mathematics operating simultaneously in multiple dimensions to fully comprehend the orders of magnitude of his wrongness. You make the call. The Churches of Atheism. The idea that he is a devotee of reason, seeing through the outdated superstitions believed by less intelligent beings, is the foremost conceit of the atheist. This heady notion was first made popular by French intellectuals and deistic atheists such as Voltaire and Denis Diderot, who ushered in the so-called Age of Enlightenment. That they also paved the way for the murderous excesses of the French Revolution and dozens of other massacres in the name of human progress is usually considered an unfortunate coincidence by their philosophical descendants. Atheism is not new. It predates Christianity by at least 400 years, according to the account of the trial of Socrates recorded by Plato in his Apology back in 399 BC. While the Athenian philosopher denied the charges of disrespecting the gods of Olympus, the fact that both Socrates and his accuser Meletus recognized the concept of atheos and argued over whether it was an accurate description of Socrates' beliefs or not is sufficient proof that there were those who did not believe in divine beings long before Richard Dawkins left the lab at Oxford and took up his cross to follow Darwin. In his review of the history of atheism, French atheologist Michel Onfray dates its explicit inception to 1729, and a book published posthumously by the Abbé Jean Meslier, the parish priest of Étrepigny in northeastern France. His Memoir of the Thoughts and Feelings of Jean Meslier, clear and evident demonstrations of the vanity and falsity of all the religions of the world, is less interesting for its historical noteworthiness than for the way it shows how little atheism has changed over the last 278 years. Meslier is perpetually indignant. He denies miracles, free will, and the soul, asserts the superiority of atheist morality, and looks forward to the, quote, happy and great revolution, unquote, to come, when reason replaces religion. According to Onfray, he even calls for an international communalism. It's really quite extraordinary. Still, one may be excused for not being aware of atheism's historic intellectual lineage, considering the copious media coverage that has been devoted to the discovery of the three men Wired magazine breathlessly dubbed the New Atheists: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. With the recent addition of Christopher Hitchens, the New Atheists are nearly as inescapable these days as they are incestuous. Here, Dawkins is lionizing Harris's wonderful little book. There he is favorably quoting Dennett, favorably quoting himself, while the works of Dawkins and Dennett top Harris's list of recommended reading. Only Hitchens, ever the iconoclast, doesn't join the endless circle jerk, keeping his references to the others at a minimum, and showing the good sense to be embarrassed by the two professors' insistence on calling themselves brights. These days, atheism is, like the atheist's ultimate destination, hot indeed. Not since the 1920s, when the faux scientific writings of Freud and Marx were inspiring European intellectuals and artists, and the latter part of the 1960s, when the American intellectual elite belatedly caught up, has there been so much enthusiasm about the non-existence of God. This is somewhat bewildering, as no one appears to be nearly as excited about a similar absence of belief in unicorns, vampires, werewolves, astrology, nation-building, or the labor theory of value. Nor is anyone dedicating much of their time to writing books and giving speeches at universities and conferences with the avowed goal of convincing others not to believe in them either. On the other hand, unicorn fanciers don't possess a great deal of influence with either of the two American political parties, and astrologers are seldom known to launch global holy wars based on the relative positions of Mars and Venus. So perhaps it's not entirely unreasonable that those concerned with the collective clout of the billions of individuals who believe in the spiritual sovereignty of a formerly deceased Jewish carpenter should seek to reduce that influence by undermining those beliefs. It is certainly in keeping with the best practices of Western intellectual debate. Adam Smith similarly attacked French physiocrats by pointing out the divergence between their theoretical system and the way in which the various national economies had been observed to operate. However, it is not only nature that abhors a vacuum. The human intellect is not well suited to stop believing in one thing without replacing that belief, nor is it comfortable for an individual to drop his self-identification without selecting an alternative. While the New Atheists express some faint hope of converting the religious faithful into believers, this is not the primary focus of their works. Dawkins and Dennett both express a degree of skepticism that theists will ever start reading their books, let alone find the courage to finish them. The atheist evangelism of The God Delusion, The End of Faith, and God is Not Great is directed at the irreligious reader. For all that Letter to a Christian Nation is nominally aimed at Christian readers, the Sunday school theology it contains makes it clear that it is actually written for the benefit of atheists whose lack of faith is weak. New atheism is a militantly fundamentalist call to arms intended to wake up the wavering. It is a godless jihad waged under a scarlet flag with a cry of Deus n'existe pas. But negation serves poorly for inspiration, so simply making the negative case against religion is not enough. To convert the godless into raging red-letter infidels, the new atheists attempt to make a positive case for something that goes well beyond not being something else. Not even the most ardent non-stamp collector is likely to take much action involving his hobby of not collecting stamps, after all. So, is there more to atheism than the simple meaning of the word, which literally means without the belief in the existence of a god or gods? The concept appears simple enough. Atheism. Without theism. As Brent Rasmussen, an atheist who writes at Unscrewing the Inscrutable, describes it, atheism describes a person in which God belief is absent. That's all. Nothing more. Black or white. On or off. There or not there. This is a perfectly reasonable definition in theory, but in practice, it's not quite that simple. As bizarre as it may sound, researchers have learned that nearly half of those who describe themselves as atheist or agnostic nevertheless believe in life after death as well as in heaven and hell. Beliefs that have been historically considered to be a fairly strong indication of theism. The Christian pollster George Barna somewhat sardonically notes that, given this apparent lack of consistency about their stated beliefs on the part of those questioned, this was far from the only serious contradiction revealed by the polling. The significance of the labels with which individuals identify themselves may not be as relevant as is ordinarily assumed. Barna's skepticism regarding self-identification appears to be justified, for it turns out that there are not only atheists who believe that they will go to heaven, there are also those who lack God belief, but who do not describe themselves as atheists. In fact, if one did not turn a jaundiced eye upon the presumed accuracy of religious self-identification, it would be very difficult to account for the large discrepancy between the number of self-identified atheists and the much larger group of people who keep turning up in polls under the group described as no religion. Now, there are three ways to interpret these two data points. 1. There is a substantive difference between being an atheist and not being religious. 2. Many people without religion still cling to a belief in God. Or 3. There are a large number of individuals who simply don't know what to call themselves. Given the large number of American voters, 26% in the 2004 election, who cannot figure out if they are Democrats or Republicans even after making a selection between the two parties, Occam's razor suggests that the third explanation is the one most likely to be correct. Richard Dawkins would surely concur, as one of the stated purposes of his book is to encourage those who are not avowed atheists to come forward and publicly identify themselves as such. But this is likely to be a vain endeavor, since the normal individual tends to put significantly more time into living his life instead of thinking about it and cataloging its abstract aspects. One can hardly expect him to devote the time and effort required to assemble an internally consistent belief system that is labeled correctly according to objective definitions approved by intellectuals. The new atheists themselves are of little help. They too muddy the water as they thrash about in their various denials of God. Richard Dawkins begins reasonably enough by suggesting that one's theistic tendencies may be viewed on a gradient of 7 degrees, ranging from complete certainty in the existence of God to complete certainty in his non-existence. However, he promptly disappoints the reader by rating himself a 6, or an agnostic who believes there is a very low probability of God's existence. But how could this be? It's as if the Archbishop of Canterbury were to declare that all Christians should doubt the existence of God. While Richard Dawkins' confession of de facto weak atheism in the place of de jure strong atheism is a little surprising, coming as it does in a section entitled The Poverty of Agnosticism, Dawkins expressed doubt that there are many who would qualify for the perfect 7 of the strong atheist is even more eyebrow-raising. This hedging, although commendable for its honesty, is in marked disharmony with the cocksure tone of the God delusion, and indeed Dawkins' public persona as the great evangelist of atheist pride. Daniel Dennett's take on the matter is a simpler one, although his call for the need to conduct a proper scientific inquiry into various matters of faith does not amount to making a serious case against religion, so much as it lays a structural foundation for someone else to begin assembling the information required for one. As for the alternative, Dennett is content to note that atheism is the negation of theism. He cannot be bothered to either delve into the definitions or construct much of a positive argument for non-belief. Despite his complaint about the way in which debates about God tend to take place in a pious fog of indeterminate boundaries, Dennett leaves it unclear whether his refusal to believe in lesser supernatural forces such as witches, Santa Claus, and Wonder Woman should properly be considered an aspect of his atheism or merely an adjunct to it. The reader might well question my need for this distinction based on the assumption that atheists reject not only God, but all aspects of the supernatural as well, were it not for Sam Harris. While Harris rejects all gods and the entire concept of faith itself on the one hand, he embraces spiritual possibilities and harbors a personal dedication to the esoteric teachings of the Buddhist faith on the other. One might assume that this would disqualify the man as an atheist, even by his own lights, but Harris adroitly evades the apparent dichotomy by redefining Buddhism as a non-religion of faith, its many faithful adherents who believe otherwise notwithstanding. This is a rather neat trick, if more than a little intellectually shabby, and one wonders if the entire conflict between new atheists and the religious folks who fill them with such fear could not be brought to a peaceful end by a similar redefinition of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even Hinduism. After all, there is surely a higher percentage of Jews who don't believe in a literal God of Abraham than Mahayana Buddhists who lack faith in the divine ability of the Amitabha Buddha to aid them in their soul's journey to Sukhavati. However, the ongoing travails of the circus formerly known as the Episcopalian Church strongly suggest that redefining religion as a social club is unlikely to prove a viable strategy in the long run. Harris's own version of atheism conveniently encompasses his unusual beliefs, as he asserts that an atheist is nothing more than a person who has read the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scriptures, considered the claims that they were written by an omniscient deity, and found them to be ridiculous. Happily for Harris, this leaves the door open for atheists to devote themselves to beliefs culled from sacred texts, such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Amitardhyana Sutra, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, while remaining godless in good standing. It seems as long as the atheist is only expanding his consciousness, transcendental meditation is laudable, although one assumes the exercise must be stopped at once should any thought of salvation, celestial Buddhas, or reaching the Pure Land happen to enter the mind of the meditator. However, Harris offers a very different definition of atheism in his Letter to a Christian Nation. Two different definitions, actually. Quote, "An atheist is simply a person who believes that the 260 million Americans, 87% of the population, claiming to never doubt the existence of God, should be obliged to present evidence for his existence, and indeed for his benevolence, given the relentless destruction of human beings we witness in the world each day. An atheist is a person who believes that the murder of a single little girl, even once in a million years, casts doubt upon the idea of a benevolent God." End quote. The evidence also suggests that an atheist is not a person who subscribes to the concepts of consistency or precision, at least not if his name is Sam Harris. One wonders where these 260 million Americans will be expected to present their evidence, and to whom, especially in a democracy where 87% of the population presumably have some say in what they are obliged to do. But these mysteries notwithstanding, it should be obvious that even among the new atheists, the nature of atheism varies somewhat depending upon the imagination of the individual infidel. And although atheism is neither a religion nor a philosophy in its own right, the attentive observer will notice that atheists can nevertheless be divided into a variety of churches, each distinct from the other, and yet as internally uniform and readily identifiable as any Christian denomination or Islamic sect. The High Church Atheists. The middle-aged man enters the room at the top of the hour. He wears a sports coat with corduroy patches on the elbow. Beneath the sports coat are an open-collared shirt and a pair of faded jeans. His ponytail is streaked with gray and accentuates his receding hairline. The faint scent of bean curds on his breath hint at his vegetarian diet. The room is crowded and takes little notice of his entrance. The middle-aged man takes his place at the front of the room. He will wait for the crowd to fall silent. A couple in the back row are talking about where they will go to the movies that night. The girl has decided she would like to go see the new Nicole Kidman film, but her boyfriend worries that there will not be enough mindless violence for him to enjoy it. The students finally notice the middle-aged man standing behind the lectern. The professor smiles. Turning his back, he begins to sketch the outline of a 45-minute diatribe on the chalkboard, which, among other things, will touch on the wonders of socialized medicine in Holland, homophobic semiotics in modern American cinema, and the squamous evil of the Fox News Channel. Despite the fact that this is supposed to be an English class, none of it has anything to do with the plays of William Shakespeare. The middle-aged man's students quickly discern that their grades will depend upon telling him what he wants to hear. Although saddened to have lost an opportunity to learn anything about the classic English literary canon to which the course is nominally devoted, they feel a tremendous delight at the inflated grades he distributes. The man's professional peers envy his tenure, although they don't approve of the way he often spends his evenings with a sensitive gay studies major prone to wearing black fingernail polish. These are the facts. This is all we know for certain about the middle-aged man. Is there anything else we can infer about him on the basis of his behavior? Was he good at sports? Is he left-handed or right-handed? Can he juggle? His actions leave no clue at all. Does he enjoy jigsaw puzzles? His behavior is simply mute on the questions of this sort, and hundreds like them. Why is it so easy, then, so trivially easy, you could almost bet your life on it easy, to guess the middle-aged man's religion, or rather his lack thereof? The fact is that a professor at an elite university is as likely to be an atheist as a suicide bomber is to be Muslim. A 2006 paper by Neil Gross of Harvard and Solon Simmons of George Mason University reported that 72.9% of the professors they polled described the Bible as, quote, an ancient book of fables, legends, history, and moral precepts, end quote, compared to 17.5% of the general population. In the same paper, 34% of all university professors described themselves as not religious, and 31.2% specified none when asked about their current religious preference. As any self-professed bright will be more than happy to inform you, those who call themselves atheists tend to be more intelligent, better educated, and wealthier than the norm, assuming that one equates education with pieces of paper collected from paper-selling institutions. It is no coincidence, then, that the new atheist triumvirate should be comprised of 2 university professors and a third fellow working toward his doctoral degree. Intelligence, education, and high incomes are not the only marks of the high church atheists. They are also extremely law-abiding, as there were only 122 atheists, 0.2% of the 65,256 prison population being held in English and Welsh jails in 2000. They tend to lean politically left, often possess a marked interest in the sciences, and are overwhelmingly confident that the various fine-tunings of Darwin's theory of evolution over the years suffice to explain the origins of man, as well as a whole host of other mysteries. And that's not all. Sam Harris is kind enough to inform us that self-professing atheists are not arrogant, dogmatic, lacking in a basis for morality, closed to spiritual experience, or responsible for the greatest crimes in human history. American Atheists, a political organization set up to protect the civil rights of atheists, chimes in with alarming cheerfulness in its declaration that atheists are also positive, eclectic, inner-directed, independent, happy. They certainly enjoy exclamation points anyhow, but not every shared trait of the high church atheist is quite as superlatively wonderful as atheists might have one believe. For example, fresh from a visit to England for an inspiring sermon from the High Church's own Archbishop of Oxford, Wired magazine writer Gary Wolfe found himself noting that atheists are almost always enthusiastic, defiant men who enjoy pissing people off. Another Dawkins interviewer, Simon Hattenstone, reached a similar conclusion. Quoting, "I agree with virtually everything he says, but find myself wanting to smack him for his intolerance." End quote. This is not unusual, as the high church atheists' undeveloped social skills are often so dramatic as to be reasonably described as a form of social autism. The atheist tends to regard every statement with which he disagrees in much the same manner that a bull views a matador's red flag, viewing even the most cherished myths held by friends and family as little more than imperative targets of opportunity. It is no wonder that the 2001 American Religious Identification Survey reported that atheists are one-third as likely to be married as the average American. These are the sorts of men who believe that boring a woman with lengthy explanations of why her opinions are incorrect is the best way to her heart. There is even evidence to suggest that, in some cases, high church atheism may be little more than a mental disorder taking the form of a literal autism. On one of the more popular atheist internet sites, the average self-reported results on an Asperger's quotient test was 27.9. The threshold for this syndrome, described as autistic psychopathy by its discoverer, Dr. Hans Asperger, is 32, whereas the average normal individual scores 16.5. In light of Wolff's observations, it is interesting to note how those diagnosed with Asperger's tend to be male, intelligent, impaired in social interaction, and prone to narrow, intense interests. This idea may explain why the following pair of definitions have proven to be useful in distinguishing between the high church atheist and the agnostic. Agnostic: I don't believe there is a God because I haven't seen the evidence. Atheist: there is no God because I'm an asshole. The low church atheists. After the Protestant Reformation fractured Christendom, the various Christian churches were deeply divided as to the proper way to worship the Lord Jesus Christ. Because the Reformed Church, better known to us today as the Puritans, rejected the Catholic Church's priestly model of worship, it saw no need for the liturgies, vestments, and ceremonial trappings that had become an integral part of Catholic ceremony over the centuries. Churches that retain these formal elements, such as the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, and the Church of Sweden, are today known as High Church, while Puritans, televangelists, snake handlers, Billy Graham crusaders in football stadiums, Jesus freaks, and Southern Baptists can all be described as Low Church. And just as an Anglican bishop in his beautiful vestments has a tendency to look somewhat askance on the crazy evangelicals who open their services with giant black singers backed by electric guitars and the preacher on the drums, the high church atheist isn't particularly keen on being lumped in with his godless brethren of the low church. The contradictory relationship between the high and low churches of atheism can perhaps be best understood by looking at the makeup of the American Democratic Party. While Democrats are heavily favored by highly educated individuals, of the sort described at the beginning of the previous section, the party's support from society's least educated individuals is not only every bit as strong, but is more electorally important. Voters with postgraduate schooling were only 25% more likely to vote for the Democratic presidential candidate in 2004, while those who did not complete high school were 90% more likely to identify themselves as Democrats. Since there are 75% more Americans who have never completed high school, 16.4% of adults over 25, than those who possess an advanced degree, 9.4%, this means that despite their reputation for being the party of the most highly educated, Democrats are nevertheless more than twice as likely to be someone who has dropped out of high school than to be an individual with a master's degree. So while it's perfectly true to say that the Democratic Party is the party of the intelligent and the educated, such a statement doesn't tell the whole story and is more than a little misleading. The same is true of atheists. The most easily identifiable factor separating low church atheists from their high church brethren is neither educational nor liturgical, but eponymical. They simply don't describe themselves as atheists. Instead, they show up on various religious surveys as no religion or occasionally secular. Their beliefs are distinctly recognizable as atheistic, as they don't believe in God, they don't attend religious services, they don't believe in the supernatural, and they don't belong to religious organizations. But a failure to openly embrace an atheist identity is not the only significant distinction of the low church atheist. I previously referenced the number of atheists being held by the prison system of England and Wales, where it is customary to record the religion of the prison population as part of the inmate information system. In the year 2000, there were 38,531 Christians of 21 different varieties imprisoned for their crimes, compared to only 122 atheists and 62 agnostics. As Europe in general and the United Kingdom in particular have become increasingly post-Christian, this would appear to be a damning piece of evidence proving the fundamentally criminal nature of theists, while demonstrating that atheists are indeed more moral despite their lack of a sky god holding them to account. However, there also happened to be another 20,639 prisoners, 31.6% of the total prison population, who possessed no religion. And this was not simply a case of people falling through the cracks or refusing to provide an answer. The inmate information system is specific enough to distinguish between Druids, Scientologists, and Zoroastrians, as well as between the Celestial Church of God, the Welsh Independent Church, and the Nonconformist Church. It also features separate categories for other Christian religion, other non-Christian religion, and not known. At only 0.2% of the prison population, high church atheists are, as previously suggested, extremely law-abiding. But when one compares the 31.6% of imprisoned no-religionists to the 15.1% of Britons who checked none or wrote in Jedi Knight, agnostic, atheist, or heathen in the 2001 national survey, it becomes clear that their low church counterparts are nearly 4 times more likely to be convicted and jailed for committing a crime than a Christian. Studies have shown that those without religion have life expectancies 7 years shorter than the average churchgoer, are more likely to smoke, abuse alcohol, and be depressed or obese, and they are much less likely to marry or have children. Their criminal proclivities strongly suggest that they are less intelligent on average than theists and high church atheists alike, and they also outnumber their high church counterparts by a significant margin. Data about religious beliefs are notoriously difficult to obtain with any degree of accuracy and can be complicated by government policies that dictate either an official religion or an official lack of religion. But the more polls one examines, the more a pattern becomes discernible. In most countries, the number of high church atheists is similar to the number of self-declared agnostics, and the total of the two combined is but a small fraction of the number of low church atheists. One interesting aspect of the European Union poll was its question about how often an individual thinks about the meaning and purpose of life. Those who don't believe in a god or life force were 27% less likely to say they spent any time thinking about such things than those who do, which tends to support the idea that low church atheists are low church precisely because they are less interested in dwelling on their disbelief and its implications than high church atheists, who seldom appear to be interested in anything else. Agnostics, the Unitarians of atheism. I once attended a friend's pagan wedding in a Unitarian church. It was both creepy and disappointing. I would have felt much more comfortable if we'd all stripped naked, painted our butts blue, and danced around a burning tree or something instead of sitting through what felt like a straight-laced parody of a Christian ceremony. Listening to the pastor appealing to our collective love for the couple to bless their union was like a religious stroll through the valley of the uncanny, wherein the very similarity between the imitation and the real thing is the cause of the creep factor. Unitarianism offers religion without faith. In a similar manner, agnosticism offers disbelief without arrogance. Whereas the atheist is always in the impossible position of trying to prove a negative, the agnostic is content to relax, kick back, and wait for others to demonstrate the proof of their assertions. And while agnostics have many things in common with high church atheists, sharing both their disbelief in God and the supernatural, as well as many of their secondary traits, it is nearly impossible to confuse the two types of non-believers. The most obvious difference is that agnostics are not at war with anyone, whereas atheists are prone to aggressively attacking just about everyone, including agnostics. Sam Harris accuses them of not being intellectually honest, while Richard Dawkins considers their views to be fence-sitting pap, an acronym of his that stands for Permanent Agnosticism on Principle, that also happens to be a word meaning to lack substance. How astonishingly witty. Hitchens takes a more ecumenical approach to non-belief, viewing atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers all as one big faithless family, while Dennett is similarly open to allowing agnostics to join him and his fellow atheists in dubbing themselves brights, should they be so inclined. Since one of the primary factors distinguishing agnostics from atheists is their disinclination to go out of their way to annoy people, it's hardly a surprise that very few, if any, agnostics have taken the professor up on his gracious offer. Agnosticism is actually a perfectly reasonable position, arguably the most reasonable position an individual can hold regarding things that cannot be possibly known with utter certainty by anyone at this point in the space-time continuum. Most atheists would be more accurately described as agnostics with personality problems. For, as philosopher Scott Adams points out on his Dilbert blog, a weak atheist is simply an ideological label for literal agnostics who want to stake out an anti-religious position despite their admission of uncertainty regarding God's existence. The fact that even the world's leading atheist confesses an inability to take a strong atheist position tends to support Adams' conclusions. I rather like self-identified agnostics. A conversation with an agnostic seldom causes anyone to get bent out of shape, and it's almost impossible to imagine an agnostic regime fighting over holy lands, interfering with people's lives, or slaughtering great quantities of people in order to destroy an existing society in an effort to create a utopian new one. No doubt it's annoying to the new atheists that so many avowedly godless individuals should roll their eyes at atheist histrionics and decline to sign up for any angry anti-theist jihads. But really, there are far worse creeds to live by than shrug and let live. The problem for agnostics is that the high church unholy warriors tend to live by the reverse of the old Arab proverb. Agnostics, despite their skepticism, are quite willing to be on friendly terms with everyone. But for the militant atheist, the friend of his enemy is his enemy too. To paraphrase Sam Harris, certainty about the absence of the next life is simply incompatible with tolerance in this one. This is why agnostics so often regard theists with puzzled bemusement, while viewing their godless cousins, with whom they superficially appear to have far more in common, with a mix of embarrassment and unadulterated horror. The apocalyptic techno-heretics. The award-winning science fiction writer Bruce Bethke has a pet theory that science fiction, especially disaster-oriented, hard science fiction, primarily exists to provide a mechanism for writing end-of-the-world stories sans theology. Left Behind for Atheists, he calls it, pointing to Greg Bear's deity-free apocalyptic novel, Forge of God, as being but one of many examples. It sounds crazy, but then it would be a mistake to discount the guy responsible for coining the term cyberpunk, because we are reliably informed that the world will end neither in ice nor fire, but in an explosion of processing power. Thus saith the prophet of the singularity, science fiction novelist Vernor Vinge, who has been predicting that superintelligent computers will surpass human intelligence, becoming self-aware and begin designing their even more intelligent successors since 1993, when he published his famous essay, The Coming Technological Singularity, How to Survive in the Post-Human Era. And while the singularity sounds suspiciously like the plotline of the Terminator movies, it's actually based on an application of Moore's law, which states that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. Because increased transistor counts translate directly into processing power measured in millions of instructions per second, this means that more transistors mean smarter computers. The Intel 4004 had only 2,300 transistors, executing 0.06 MIPS in 1971, while the Intel Core 2 Duo processor in the laptop with which I am now typing these words possesses 291 million transistors, executing 21,418 MIPS. Exactly how many MIPS are required before a machine will awaken and become self-conscious remains unknown. But in his essay, Vinge wrote that he expected it would happen before 2030, if it happened at all. Ray Kurzweil, on the other hand, gives humanity until 2035. Ken MacLeod, a Scottish science fiction author, describes the singularity as the rapture for nerds. And in the same way that Christians are divided into preterist, premillennialist, and postmillennialist camps regarding the time of the Parousia, apocalyptic techno-heretics can be divided into 3 sects: renunciationist, apotheosin, and posthumanist. Whereas renunciationists foresee a dark future, wherein humanity is enslaved or even eliminated by its machine masters, and await the singularity with the same sort of resignation that Christians who don't buy into the rapture doctrine anticipate the tribulation and the Antichrist, apotheosins anticipate a happy and peaceful amalgamation into a glorious godlike hive mind of the sort envisioned by Isaac Asimov in his Foundation novels. Posthumanists, meanwhile, envision a détente between man and machine wherein artificial intelligence will be wedded to intelligence amplification and other forms of technobiological modification to transform humanity and allow it to survive and perhaps even thrive in the post-human era. Although it is rooted entirely in science and technology, there are some undeniable religious parallels between the more optimistic visions of the singularity and conventional religious faith. Not only is there a strong orthogenetic element inherent in the concept itself, but the transhuman dream of achieving immortality through uploading one's consciousness into machine storage and interacting with the world through electronic avatars sounds suspiciously like shedding one's physical body in order to walk the streets of gold with a halo and harp. Furthermore, the predictions of when this watershed event is expected to occur rather remind one of Sir Isaac Newton's tireless attempts to determine the precise date of the eschaton, which he finally concluded would take place sometime after 2065, only 30 years after Kurzweil expects the singularity. So if they're both correct, at least mankind can console itself that the machine age will be a short one. The Atheists' Creed. In 325 AD, Christian leaders found it necessary to convene a council at Nicaea in order to provide all Christendom with an ecumenical statement of Christian faith. Amazingly, they were successful, for despite the subsequent splintering of Christianity into hundreds, if not thousands, of churches and denominations, each with their own idiosyncratic customs and exotic dogmas, the Nicene Creed still serves very well to distinguish the Christian from the not Christian. Atheism has no such creed, but it could certainly use one. Given the variety of atheisms already mentioned, we need one to serve as a legitimate and reasonable basis for discussing atheism throughout the course of this book. Fortunately, American Atheists has provided a clear and unambiguous statement that ecumenically encompasses the various core beliefs of the vast majority of atheists, high church, low church, and heretic alike, which I have taken the liberty of having translated into Latin in order to give it the proper magisterial grandeur. Praeter res naturales nihil extat, cogitatio est proprietas materiae, singula animalia omnioque irrevocabiliter mors terminat. Sunt nullae vires, nullae res, nullae entia, quae distant natura, vel extra naturam sunt. Sunt nullae vires, nullae res, nullae entia, quae natura superant. Sunt nullae vires, nullae res, nullae entia, quae supra naturam sunt. Nec fiere possunt. Which translates to, nothing exists but natural phenomena. Thought is a property or function of matter. Death irreversibly and totally terminates individual organic units. There are no forces, phenomena, or entities which exist outside of or apart from physical nature. There are no forces, phenomena, or entities which transcend nature. There are no forces, phenomena, or entities which are supernatural, nor can there be. As the Creed indicates, atheism of all variants requires a focus on material phenomena. High church atheists, agnostics, and apocalyptics tend to enjoy contemplating some of the more esoteric manifestations, while low church atheists are inclined to focus on quotidian ones, such as cars, clothes, and the stereo system next door. But because the new atheists are uniformly high church, their anti-theistic arguments are invariably intertwined with man's primary method for comprehending and utilizing material phenomena, which is to say, science. Chapter 2. Defining Science. Where there is shouting, there is no true science. Leonardo Da Vinci. In the summer of 1992, my band was scheduled to play on the second stage at the Chicago Lollapalooza, one slot ahead of Temple of the Dog. As it turned out, we never ended up taking the stage thanks to our singer, who stayed at a different hotel, managed to get lost, and didn't show up until the end of the day. But the afternoon was far from a complete loss, as we spent a happy afternoon underneath a blazing hot sun, drinking, shaking the girl tree, and watching the Jesus and Mary Chain, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden warm up the crowd for the apocalyptic show that Ministry put on at sunset. What I remember most about that summer day wasn't the Red Hot Chili Peppers or any of the big-name bands. It was the Jim Rose Circus Sideshow. It wasn't any of the painful feats performed by the Torture King or the amazing Mr. Lifto that burned their way into my brain either, but Jim Rose enthusiastically bellowing, "It is science!" every time cinder blocks were attached to nipples or broken glass was devoured. It is science! But torture, even public self-torture, is not generally considered to be genuine science, no matter how entertaining its observers might find it to be. The National Academy of Sciences does not recognize torture as one of its 31 disciplinary sections, and its practitioners have not historically been admitted as members, at least not on that sole basis. Nor can every act performed by a genuine scientist be legitimately described as science. If the bear's proverbial actions in the woods are not classified as science, the scientists should not be either. This is a book about religion and atheism, not science, but it is impossible to entirely separate atheism from science, because scientific materialism has such an influence on atheistic thinking even in matters where science is not directly involved. For some atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, science played an important role in causing them to abandon their former faiths, but now serves primarily as a foundation for an ongoing intellectual journey. For others, it is a religion substitute that provides them with purpose and a secular priesthood to whom they look for answers. Due to the frequent entanglement of atheism and science, it is crucial to distinguish between that which is science and that which is not science at all before one can seriously examine the new atheist's arguments. The need to separate real science from non-science can also be seen in the way that the phrase "studies show" has become a secular form of making a vow, a useful means of reassuring the skeptical listener that the speaker is swearing to the truth of his words despite any doubts that the listener might harbor. Another problem is the increasing appearance of meta-study abuse in the news media, a bizarre, pseudoscientific variant of attempting to determine the truth by means of a democracy wherein each quasi-scientific study gets a vote. Now that studies show is no longer considered a sufficiently conclusive 9 out of 10 studies show is supposed to be more convincing. But this is chewing gum advertising, not science. So what is science if it is not self-skewering, timber littering, or vote counting? Richard Dawkins, who has devolved from spending his time performing genuine science in the field of evolutionary biology to performing in public as a professional science propagandist, is surprisingly unhelpful in this regard, especially considering that it is his job to help the public better understand science. While he leaves the reader with no doubt that he likes science very much indeed, his description of it in Unweaving the Rainbow bears more similarity to the Apostle Paul's description of love recorded in his first letter to the Corinthians than to anything approaching a useful definition. Science is hard and challenging. Science is wonderful. Science can pay its own way, even if it doesn't have to. Science is fun. It is the very opposite of boring. Science should never be dumbed down, for it can enthrall a good mind for a lifetime. Those best qualified to appreciate science are real poets and true scholars of literature. Science does not have an anti-poetic spirit. It is never dry and cold, it is not cheerless, nor is it overbearing. Science allows mystery, but not magic, and strangeness beyond imagining, but no cheap and easy miracles. It ought to be motivated by a sense of wonder, and is occasionally arrogant, but then it has a certain amount to be arrogant about. It progresses by correcting its mistakes, and makes no secret of what it still does not understand. In the humble philosophical tradition of Socrates, its very essence is to know what we do not know. And even if there are dangers of becoming intoxicated, we can rest assured that the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. If, at this point, the reader is beginning to wonder if Dr. Dawkins has perhaps more than a little in common with Dr. Timothy Leary or fellow evolutionary theorist Terence McKenna, he may be assured that he is not alone. After all, it wasn't prayer and fasting that produced lysergic acid diethylamide. But if Oxford's most famous professor never quite gets around to answering the question, the Oxford English Dictionary does not shirk from the task. It defines science as, quote, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Origin, Latin scientia, from scire, to know. There, was that so hard? Science is systematic study done through observation and experiment. Therefore, if the study is not systematic, or if observation and experiment are not involved, it is obviously not science by this definition. This is a key point. If observation and experiment are not involved, then it is not science. Unless, of course, one is defining it differently, as some scientists are wont to do. One of the more famous alternate definitions, and one to which both Dawkins and Hitches make reference, is that provided by the Austrian Karl Popper, a professor at the London School of Economics, who is considered to have been one of the leading philosophers of science. Popper's primary criterion for distinguishing between science and not science is the concept of falsifiability. For a hypothesis to be falsifiable, it must be theoretically possible to make an observation that would disprove the subject. Atheists are particularly fond of this definition, as the difficulty involved in falsifying a supernatural God allows them to argue that religion cannot be science. But can Popper's concept of falsifiability really be taken seriously as a dividing point between science and not science? It appears more than a little flawed to me. Let's begin with postulating that a study of the language of the gods is not proper science, whereas a study of the color of swans is. I base this premise on the classic example of a falsifiable proposition, the statement that all swans are white. The fact that one could prove this proposition to be wrong by observing a black swan makes it falsifiable, and therefore a proper scientific matter. It is not the truth or untruth of the proposition that is important, only the fact that the truth or untruth could be determined by observation. The problem here is that the proposition all gods speak Aramaic is equally falsifiable, given that the theoretical observation of a monolingual Greek-speaking God would suffice to falsify the proposition. This would, therefore, make divine linguistics a legitimate matter of science, the current difficulty of observing gods notwithstanding. And however impossible it might seem to credit, divine linguistics has indeed been an object of serious contemplation throughout history by some of mankind's greatest minds, including Dante and Leibniz. Now, Popper would presumably describe this as naive falsification and place swan's color in the category approved by sophisticated methodological falsification, and linguistics divine in the category not approved by it. But this merely expands the falsifiability test into a haphazard, technology-driven definition that dives headlong into tautology, defining science as whatever scientists believe science to be at the moment, or worse, whatever scientists are doing. This is dangerous ground, for it hoists science and scientists upon the paradoxical horns of their own Euthyphro dilemma, which, if applied in the same manner that it is applied to God and morality, would force one to conclude that science does not exist. But given the masses of empirical evidence that testify to the material existence of both science and scientists, I assert that the more reasonable conclusion is that A. Science does exist, and B. The men of Athens had a pretty good point. In any event, the falsifiability definition is nebulous enough to be pretty useless. If Richard Dawkins is less than forthcoming, despite his volubility, we are fortunate to discover that one of his comrades in evolutionary biology, P.Z. Myers, is distinctly more helpful. In addition to his duties as a professor of biology, Dr. Myers runs one of the Internet's more popular science blogs, Pharyngula. When I posed the question to him, "What is science?" he responded with not one, but 3 definitions, all of them quite useful. 1. Science is a changing and growing collection of knowledge, characterized by transparency, all methods are documented and the lineage of ideas can be traced, and testability, prior work can be repeated or its results evaluated. It is an edifice of information that contains all of the details of its construction. 2. Science is what scientists do. We have institutions that train people and employ them in the business of generating new knowledge. And we have procedures like the bestowal of degrees and ranks that certify one's membership in the hallowed ranks of science. 3. Science is a process. It is a method for exploring the natural world by making observations, drawing inferences, and testing those inferences with further experimentation and observation. It isn't so much the data generated as it is a way of thinking critically about the universe and our own interpretations of it. What we understand as science consists of 3 separate and distinct aspects: a dynamic body of knowledge, scientage, a process, scientody, and a profession, scientistry. This 3-in-1 works together in a unified manner that should be recognizable to the sufficiently educated, wherein the body of knowledge reigns supreme. The process offers the only way to the body of knowledge, and those who blaspheme against the profession will not be forgiven. And, as this analogy suggests, it is the process that is the significant aspect insofar as humanity is concerned. This tripartite distinction makes it precisely clear just what Richard Dawkins is so enamored with, as when he sings the praise of rapturous wonders and poetic inspirations, he is not referring to science as a profession, but rather science as a body of knowledge, whereas When he describes it as hard and challenging, fun, and motivated by a sense of wonder, he is making reference to science as a process. It should be equally obvious that it is this second definition, or science as process, which is described by the Oxford English Dictionary. Therefore, that is the definition we shall henceforth use throughout the course of this book. But before proceeding, it is intriguing to at least consider the possibility that it is not the threat to science as process that so offends scientists, but rather the potential threat to science as profession that has whipped some scientists into an angry lather. After all, scientists understand better than most how their bread gets buttered, and no one, not even the most dedicated idealist, is ever pleased with the possibility of that butter being taken away. It seems unlikely, however, that the passion of Richard Dawkins and the fervent militancy of Sam Harris in defense of science can be tied to any such fears. This would make little sense, since neither Sam Harris nor Christopher Hitchens are even scientists. Daniel C. Dennett has tenure, and the success of Richard Dawkins' many books has surely put him well beyond any petty pecuniary concerns. And regarding any potential fears for the profession as a whole, not even the most die-hard young Earth creationist or intelligent design advocate is calling for a ban on carbon dating or experiments in evolutionary biology, let alone mass defundings of public science programs and corporate-sponsored research. Nor can their concerns be realistically tied to any fears for science as a body of knowledge, the occasional rhetorical sally aside. The protest of a biology textbook or a 19th century novel notwithstanding, no one on either side of the debate is advocating the willful destruction or even reduction of the knowledge base. As for the process, the very existence of the intelligent design movement is a testimony to the respect for scientific methodology and an attempt to make use of it for marketing purposes, not a desire to destroy it. But if religion poses no real threat to science in any of its forms, upon what is this vehement hostility towards religion on the part of science's self-appointed defenders based? What is the reason for all the shouting? Science versus religion. The idea that science and religion are regarded as being inherently in conflict with one another is a very well accepted idea these days, but this was not always the case. Some of history's greatest scientists are known to have been men of great Christian faith, while even some of those who weren't, such as Leonardo da Vinci, were on amiable enough terms with the Church to work for it, and produced their masterworks based on its religious themes. Ironically, the famous institution where Richard Dawkins is currently employed was once a place where every fellow of the university was expected to be an ordained priest, until Sir Isaac Newton broke the mold at Cambridge with the permission of King Charles II. As Dawkins himself admits, the overwhelming majority of scientists throughout centuries in which the scientific process was developed were religious, or at least claimed to be. Newton did indeed claim to be religious, so did almost everybody until, significantly I think, the 19th century, when there was less social and judicial pressure than in earlier centuries to profess religion, and more scientific support for abandoning it." End quote. What's significant about this statement is the way it contradicts the notion that the Catholic Church had been dogmatically opposing science, as evidenced by its notorious trial of Galileo Galilei, all throughout the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, and well into the 18th century. Indeed, most people today are under the vague impression that the very reason for the Dark Ages' grim nomenclature stems from a puritanical, power-hungry, monolithic church's iron-fisted repression of science and human liberty, a totalitarian religious oppression that was finally shaken off by the bold free thinkers of the Enlightenment. But as medievalists, such as Umberto Eco, and numerous historians have explained in copious detail, this simply is not true. The Dark Ages were no more dark than the Church was undivided. The negative view of the medieval period has a long and interesting history. Edward Gibbon, the author of the classic The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, famously describes them as priest-ridden, superstitious, dark times. Of course, it can be reasonably suggested that anyone who is fascinated enough with the Roman Empire to write 1.5 million words in 6 volumes about it, and is blindly prejudiced enough to blame its ultimate collapse on a religion that did not become commonplace until centuries after Juvenal was satirizing the mad decadence of imperial Roman society, is perhaps unlikely to be the most accurate guide in these matters. What is fascinating is that this modern misconception of medieval times is at least partly based on the romantic perspective of a 14th century Italian poet, Francesco Petrarca, a Christian humanist better known in English as Petrarch, who is considered to have created the very concept of the Dark Ages. Scholars assert that it was Petrarch who reversed the classic Christian metaphor of pagan darkness giving way to the light of the world, and eventually came to view his own time as a dark age following a lost golden antiquity. This reversed metaphor was picked up by medieval writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio, then again by anti-religious Enlightenment intellectuals such as Denis Diderot, Louis de Jaucourt, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who established the reverse tradition that persists today. Theodore Mommsen, whose essay on Petrarch was recently selected as one of the 13 most important critical essays on the Italian Renaissance, makes a convincing case of how it was Petrarch's fixation on Rome's past glories and his awe of its grandiose ruins that led him to conclude, mostly on the basis of his nationalistic contempt for Germanic domination of what had once been an Italian empire, that he lived in an age of tenebrae, or darkness. Quote, "From these passages it is clear that Petrarch discarded the whole history of the Roman Empire during late antiquity and the Middle Ages, because within that age, everywhere in the Western world had come into power barbarous nations, which brought even Rome and the Romans under their domination. Because Petrarch could think of this whole development only with a feeling of scornful grief, he consistently consigned it to oblivion in all his writings. In his letters, time and again, he conjures up the great shades of antiquity, but scarcely ever does he refer to a medieval name." End quote. It is ironic that the lamentations of an Italian Christian for the lost greatness of his nation, a fate for which Christianity could not possibly bear any significant responsibility, should be so twisted as to take on an anti-Christian religious implication, instead of the obvious anti-German nationalistic one. And while it is true that 3 of the barbarian kings who sacked Rome from 410 to 546 AD were Christians, it must be noted that not only had the empire already been divided by this time, but the capital of the Western Roman Empire had been moved first to Milan, then Ravenna by the Emperor Honorius. It is not within the scope of this book to consider why many Enlightenment intellectuals were opposed to Christianity in general, and the Church in particular. It is enough to simply note that this was the case. In his Lectures on Modern European Intellectual History, the historian Stephen Creese, author of The History Guide, summarizes the Enlightenment figures thusly. In the final analysis, the philosophes differed widely. To speak of them as a movement is to label them a school of thought. However, what united them all was their common experience of shedding their inherited Christian beliefs with the aid of classical thinkers, specifically Roman, and for the sake of modern philosophy. They were agreed that Christianity was a supernatural religion. It was wrong. It was unreasonable. It was the infamous. "Escrasez l'infâme," shouted Voltaire. "Wipe it out. Wipe out the infamous." Only science, with its predictable results, was the way to truth, moral improvement, and happiness. This was particularly true of the French encyclopedists, and the influence of their landmark Encyclopédie paved the way for modern rationalism and the French Revolution, as well as firmly fixed the notion of the irrationality, superstition, and tyranny of the previous millennium in the public consciousness. By waging a fierce intellectual war against religion in the name of reason, and by defining the two concepts in inherent opposition to each other, it was the philosophes who were responsible for weakening that pre-19th century social and judicial pressure to which Richard Dawkins referred. It is fitting, therefore, that in his Petrarch essay, Mommsen should make use of encyclopedia definitions from 1883 and 1929 to trace the evolution of the term Dark Ages from a period of intellectual depression in the history of Europe from the 5th century to the revival of learning about the beginning of the 15th, to the contrast, once so fashionable, between the ages of darkness and the ages of light, have no more truth in it than have the idealistic fancies which underlie attempts at medieval revivalism." Although historians rejected this idea of intellectual depression and religious oppression more than 70 years ago, it is apparent that this rejection has not yet managed to dislodge the commonplace belief in the fundamental rivalry between religion and reason, established nearly 300 years ago by the passionate, rational materialists of the Enlightenment. Resurrecting the Myth. Thomas Riggins, in the Marxist journal Political Affairs, notes that many Enlightenment intellectuals were not opposed to religion in itself, but rather to religion being used by dictatorial religious elements, using religion for their own selfish purposes. In a variant on this theme, I suggest that the new atheists are not actually particularly interested in defending science in itself, but are deeply afraid of science reaching a friendly rapprochement with religion. Since we have already established that the opposition of Dawkins, Dennett, and Harris to religion does not stem from any rational fears for science as a body of knowledge, a profession, or a process, and that there was no significant historical enmity between science and religion, it is apparent that the new atheists' stated desire to destroy religion must stem from another source, and given the way in which their opposition to religion so closely resembles that of their rationalist antecedents, it is reasonable to suggest that they are not so much interested in defending science as they are in advocating an outdated 19th century meme. The evidence fits the hypothesis. As will be demonstrated subsequently in no little detail, Richard Dawkins' grasp of history is not so much outdated as non-existent. As for his adherence to the Enlightenment rather than science, he makes as many references to Denis Diderot in The God Delusion as he does to Sir Isaac Newton. But even if Dawkins can't quite make up his mind as to the proper way to categorize the beliefs of the man he rightly describes as the great encyclopedist of the Enlightenment, there can be no question of his allegiance to Diderot's ideals. As in 2006, he informed the Sunday Times that he was setting up a charity to divert donations from the hands of missionaries and church-based charities because the Enlightenment is under threat. So is reason, so is truth, so is science." End quote. Science, you'll note, actually comes in fourth, not first as you might have erroneously guessed. Dawkins thus reveals that it is not science in itself that he is defending so vociferously, but rather his Enlightenment ideals. It appears to be the possibility of the subversion of science to serve the interests of Christian values instead of those of its 19th century competitor that has stimulated him to such feverish activity. This may also explain why Dawkins is so strangely unconcerned with other religions, including Islam, which would otherwise appear to pose a far greater threat to both science and the West. It is even easier to establish Daniel C. Dennett's belief in precisely the same ideals, as Dennett not only directly equates science with the Enlightenment, but also states that his view of science is very much an Enlightenment view. And he sounds an unexpectedly Petrarchian strain by referring to the Enlightenment as a ruined antiquity, to which he has dedicated himself to rebuilding. Quote, "Several hundred years ago, at the triumph of the Enlightenment, which you and I both admire and wish to restore, many wise, well-informed people were very sure that now we had science and enlightenment upon us, religion would soon die out. They were colossally wrong." End quote. It is important to note Dennett's distinction between science and enlightenment. While the two are allies, they are manifestly not one and the same. And one very much hopes that when Dennett speaks of wishing to restore 200-year-old triumphs, he is not referring to La Terreur. Sam Harris is known to be motivated by the same ideals as well, as Chris Lehman of Reason recognized when he noted Harris's litany of Enlightenment-era objections to medieval models of piety in his review of The End of Faith. It must be confessed that Harris doesn't refer directly to the Enlightenment himself in either of his books, but then, given his demonstration in them of his near-complete ignorance of religious, military, European, and world history, it is possible that he has never heard of Diderot, the encyclopedists, or the philosophes, despite his regurgitation of their philosophy. Dawkins, Dennett, and Harris, with academic credentials and standing as public intellectuals, represent the highest of the high church atheists, but their dedication to science as a primary vehicle for their enlightened faith is shared by even the humblest of the rationalists, as is their missionary zeal. Consider the way in which one unknown science blogger describes herself in vintage Petrarchian terms. A self-proclaimed atheistic evolutionist missionary who thinks of herself as a voice of rationality in a dark, gloomy world. Dennett is far from the only one who considers the triumph of the Enlightenment to be far from complete. Despite how it is commonly portrayed by the new atheists, the rationalist war on religion cannot properly be described as a war between science and religion. It is more akin to a tug-of-war between rationalists and religionists over the way in which science is to be henceforth used and the purposes to which science is ultimately harnessed. If religion and science were as fundamentally incompatible as the new atheists assert, then it would seem more than a little strange that the magazine Nature, which bills itself as the International Weekly Journal of Science, would concur with Science magazine in reporting that one of the places where science is growing fastest is Iran, a country not exactly famous for its militant atheism or general disdain for religion. The supposed incompatibility between religion and science can't be all that great if it is necessary to threaten the Islamic Republic with airstrikes and invasion in order to prevent its scientists from performing research in unapproved areas. And while it is indisputable that there are fewer scientists today who are openly religious than there were 200 years ago, they do exist. Dawkins admits the fact, but deals with this dichotomy by suspecting that most of the more recent ones are religious only in the Einsteinian sense, before pronouncing himself baffled by the genuine religious faith on the part of those individuals with whom he has had personal contact. I suggest it would be more rational for Dawkins to assume that scientists who dare to openly assert their faith today are most likely religious in the conventional sense of the word, particularly given the way they can expect to be viewed with baffled amusement by their colleagues. It is worth noting that this supposition would also have the benefit of being supported rather than contradicted by Dawkins' own anecdotal experience. Despite this decrease in the number of religious scientists over the last 2 centuries, the great crime of Christianity against science is still generally considered to have been the Catholic Church putting Galileo Galilei, the father of modern physics, on trial for heresy. It is usually forgotten, however, that the ban on publication of Galileo's Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems was only nominal, and that his Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relating to 2 new sciences was published without incident in the Christian Netherlands in 1638, 5 years after the trial. It is particularly ironic and perhaps even unfair that Christians today are condemned for Pope Urban VIII's belief in the geocentric system formulated by the pagan Greek astrologer Ptolemy, while the heliocentric system that provides the basis for this condemnation is named for Nicholas Copernicus, the Catholic cleric who formulated the modern heliocentric theory in On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres. Copernicus's masterwork, which is considered to be a defining moment in the history of science, was published in 1543, a scant 89 years before Galileo's supposed overturning of geocentric Christian dogma. Furthermore, if one considers the fact that the Catholic Church reconsidered the issue and authorized the publication of Galileo's works in 1741, It seems a bit offensive to continue to hold the Pope's abuse of his office against Southern Baptists and Methodists 375 years after the fact. There is also genuine cause for doubting whether Enlightenment atheism and science can honestly be considered as fundamentally compatible as religion and science have been for centuries. It is worth noting that it was neither Christians nor Muslims, but revolutionary atheists inspired by Enlightenment ideals who beheaded the man known today as the father of modern chemistry, Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier, in 1794, declaring, "La République n'a pas besoin de savants ni de chimistes. Le cours de la justice ne peut être suspendu." Chapter 3. The Case Against Science. Our technical advances in the art of war have finally rendered our religious differences, and hence our religious beliefs, antithetical to our survival. We can no longer ignore the fact that billions of our neighbors believe in the metaphysics of martyrdom, or in the literal truth of the Book of Revelation, or any of the other fantastical notions that have lurked in the minds of the faithful for millennia. Because our neighbors are now armed with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, there is no doubt that these developments mark the terminal phase of our credulity. Words like God and Allah must go the way of Apollo and Baal, or they will unmake our world. Sam Harris, The End of Faith. As Richard Dawkins demonstrates in his Ode to Science, Unweaving the Rainbow, the new atheists harbor nearly as great a love for science as they do a hatred for religion. Like the science fetishists who regard science as a basis for dictating human behavior, atheists like to posit that man has evolved to a point where he is ready to move beyond religion. This has been their constant theme for more than 100 years, but as Daniel C. Dennett points out, the evidence is mounting that this simply isn't going to happen. A more interesting and arguably more relevant question that none of the new atheists dare to ask is whether science, having produced some genuinely positive results, as well as some truly nightmarish evils over the course of the last century, has outlived its usefulness to mankind. Man has survived millennia of religious faith, but if the prophets of overpopulation and global warming are correct, he may not survive a mere 4 centuries of science. In spite of his scientific pretensions, Sam Harris is a mere science fetishist. His book, The End of Faith, is a profoundly non-scientific expression of hope, wrapped up in an emotional plea. This is why many militant atheists find it so stirring, and why more rational non-believers find it uncompelling. It is not, as some optimistic infidels would have it, a prediction, much less a coherent case leading to a logical conclusion. It's just another expression of faith in Enlightenment utopianism. And as Harris's brave words about an absence of doubt indicate, it is an expression of surprisingly blind faith, lacking both common sense and evidence. The 5 major religions of the world, in order of their appearance on the scene, are Hinduism, traditional Chinese folk religion, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. These 5 religions have approximately 4.85 billion adherents, representing an estimated 71.3% of the world's population in 2007. And they have been around for a collective 11,600 years. During the vast majority of those 116 centuries, the world has not been in any danger of extinction from weapons of any kind, nor has the human race been in serious danger of dying out from pollution, global warming, overpopulation, or anything else. Despite 116 centuries filled with hundreds, if not thousands of diverse religions, all competing for mindshare, resources, and dominance, the species has not merely survived, it has thrived. There is no aspect of Hindu teaching that has produced a means of potentially extinguishing mankind. The occasional 11th century rampages by the Sohei of Mount Hiei notwithstanding, Buddhism provides no method of destroying the planet. While Christians have been waiting patiently for the world to end for nearly 2,000 years now, without doing much to immanentize the eschaton, except for occasionally footing the bill for Jews making aliyah. Islam, for all the danger it supposedly presents, has not produced a significant military technology since Damascene steel was developed in the 12th century, and even that is of nebulous connection to the religion itself. Modern science has only been around for the last 350 years. If we date the scientific method back to the man known as the father of science, Galileo Galilei, one could push that date back considerably if one wished to Aristotle and Archimedes, or forward to Newton and the Age of Enlightenment. But regardless, the dire threat to mankind described by Harris only dates back to the middle of the 20th century. In the last 60 years, science has produced a veritable witch's brew of potential dangers to the human race, ranging from atom-smashing explosive devices to lethal genetic modifications, designer diseases, large quantities of radioactive waste, and even, supposedly, the accidental production of many black holes and strangelets through particle collider experiments. So, in only 3% of the time that religion has been on the scene, science has managed to produce multiple threats to continued human existence. Moreover, the quantity and lethal quality of those threats appear to be accelerating, as the bulk of them have appeared in the most recent sixth of the scientific era. It is not the purpose of this chapter to examine whether religion exacerbates or alleviates these scientific threats. That appraisal must wait for a later chapter. Harris's Extinction Equation, which states that S plus F equals doom, is not inherently wrong, but his conclusion is, because it is science, not faith, that is the factor in the equation that presents a deadly danger to mankind. This is true of both the military and non-military threats to humanity. While the jury is still out on the precise nature of the threat caused by global warming, there can be no doubt that the scientific method is at least in part responsible for it, along with the threat supposedly posed by overpopulation, pollution, and genetic engineering. Religion simply cannot be held accountable for any of these things, not even overpopulation. What could be more absurd than to claim that the Baha'i are in some way responsible for any damage to humanity caused by CERN's Large Hadron Collider? Not even the most militant new atheist would dare set himself up for public ridicule that way. And yet, making religious faith the significant variable in the Extinction Equation is no less ludicrous. However, the guilt of Scientology does not mean that the profession of science can be held entirely blameless. The fact that it was the method that made the development of these threats possible does not indicate that their development via the method was inevitable. It was scientists who freely made the choice to develop these theories and, in many cases, the weapons. Sometimes in innocence, like Alfred Nobel being stunned to learn that his blasting cap and smokeless explosives would cause him to be remembered as the Merchant of Death, and sometime in full cognizance of their moral culpability, as in the case of Albert Einstein's 1939 letter to President Roosevelt, written in the hopes of encouraging FDR to build an atomic bomb. It is not the combination of religion and science, then, but rather the combination of scientists and the scientific method that has created this panoply of mortal dangers to mankind. The good, the bad, and the scientific. Questioning science in this manner invariably leads to one of 5 responses, often rather heated. 1. The first response is an ad hominem one, insisting the individual is only questioning the inherent magnificence of science because he is stupid, anti-science, or incapable of understanding science. Like most ad hominem responses, this one is invalid because it doesn't even begin to dispute the issues raised. Neither the level of my intelligence nor my personal opinion about science is a factor in the question of whether some aspect of science is responsible for posing a threat to humanity. One need not understand a human being or the operation of the human body to comprehend that a particular individual is guilty of committing murder after witnessing the act. 2. The second response is to wonder how it is possible to live in the modern world, make use of modern technology, and still harbor any doubts that the benefits of science are worth whatever the costs might happen to be. After all, we have electricity, computers, television, X-rays, automobiles, antibiotics, vaccines, and many other valuable things thanks to science. Science has increased our lifespan. It has significantly increased the average individual's chance of surviving childbirth and childhood, and it has made those longer lives considerably more comfortable. I do not dispute any of this, but I do note that this is a fundamentally illogical response. Since if humanity is in danger of being wiped out by the weapons that science has also produced, then there will not be anyone to continue enjoying those scientific benefits. It does not matter how many wonderful contributions to humanity have been produced thanks to science, because wiping them all out is the equivalent of multiplying their sum by 0. One could certainly argue that the threat to humanity from science is really not all that dire. But then it would be necessary to admit that religious faith poses no threat to humanity either, thus demonstrating Harris's thesis to be entirely bankrupt. 3. The third is to argue that science cannot be held responsible for the evils it enables, because to do so is to confuse facilitation with prescription. It is claimed that although science made the atomic bomb possible, and scientists designed, tested, and built the bombs, it does not follow that science is responsible for the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A variant on this is to argue that because the evils are not performed specifically in the name of science or in the interest of a scientific agenda, they cannot be blamed on science. There are 3 errors inherent in this third response. The first is that causal factors do not depend upon motive. No reasonable individual would accept the argument that cigarettes don't cause lung cancer because no one smokes in the name of Marlboro or in the interest of a cigarette agenda. The distinction between motive and method may be significant in a court of law, but is largely irrelevant when considering if a particular problem exists and how it can best be solved. The second error is that the presence of the danger is solely due to the existence of these dangerous weapons and technologies, while blame for any decision to actually use them should rightly fall upon the various politicians and government leaders who make those decisions based on a variety of reasons. Blame for their existence can only lie with their creators. The third error is that numerous evils have historically been committed, justified, and utilized by scientists in the name of science, as demonstrated by the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the attempts of hypothermia research at the University of Minnesota and Victory University to use Nazi data obtained at Dachau, and the Atlas of Topographical and Applied Human Anatomy, which was produced with the bodies of 1,377 executed criminals sent to Professor Eduard Pernkopf at the University of Vienna by the Gestapo. Although the defenders of science inevitably claim that unpleasantries such as Nazi science, racist science, and the 64,000 forced sterilizations done at the behest of American eugenicists should not be blamed on science because it is today considered bad science, it is worth noting that religious individuals who commit acts in complete contradiction of their religious tenets are never absolved of responsibility for their crimes on the basis of their bad theology. The fact that Richard Dawkins and other atheists have publicly called to reconsider the legitimacy of eugenics also serves to demonstrate that the historical evils of eugenics are properly blamed on science and scientists. 4. The fourth response is to claim that it is unfair to blame science for the actions of some scientists. Of course, it must then be equally unfair to blame religion for the action of some religious individuals. And it is spectacularly unfair to blame the adherents of one religion for the actions of a completely different religion, especially when those adherents are being actively persecuted by the members of that other religion. It is wildly irrational to argue that a religious moderate is somehow responsible for the actions of religious extremists he does not know and has never met, but that one scientist cannot be blamed for the actions of another scientist, not even one who belongs to the same professional organization or university, and with whom he presumably has some influence. Also, one must always be careful to distinguish between the 3 aspects of science. Whether one is holding a particular scientist or the scientific method itself accountable for a particular scientific misdeed, this does not necessarily impute any blame to other scientists. 5. The fifth and final response is to declare that knowledge, regardless of its risks, is always better than ignorance. As Dr. P.Z. Myers puts it, quote, "That's a deeply cynical view that Day has, that ignorance is better than knowledge, because awareness hurts, and technological process brings great risks. I guess I must be more optimistic than a weird Christian nihilist, because I think it is better to aspire to a better world than to give up and slide back into some benighted religious illusion." End quote. But I'm not arguing that ignorance is better than knowledge. I'm merely pointing out that the evidence suggests that in some circumstances, ignorance may be preferable to knowledge, especially partial knowledge imperfectly understood and enthusiastically embraced too soon. I'm not eager to return humanity to a Stone Age state, an ironic accusation given Albert Einstein's assertion that the Fourth World War would be fought with stones and clubs, thanks in part to his scientific legacy. I am actually a classic early adopter. But just as it is now considered bad science, if not an atrocity, to have sterilized thousands of American citizens against their will, it is not hard to imagine that there is likely a non-zero amount of scientific activity today that will be considered equally mistaken, perhaps even equally atrocious, in the future. Only a complete fool would argue that all risks are inherently worth taking, or that all knowledge is inherently worth pursuing. Is the mapping of the human genome worth risking the possibility that some individuals will be denied insurance for diseases they are genetically bound to develop? I think so. Is it worth risking the development of genetic weapons coded to kill all individuals possessing a certain genetic marker? I'm not so sure about that, and there is certainly a case to be made that it isn't, especially by those who happen to belong to a group likely to be targeted by such an insidious invention. The argument that all risks are worth taking and all knowledge is worth pursuing is not only foolish, it is an argument that is based on neither evidence nor reason, only blind secular faith. Technological progress offers no guarantees of a better world, no matter how strong one's optimistic aspirations or beliefs in man's inevitable progress toward a self-made paradise on earth might be. As for the better world of today, there are 3 obvious flaws in the assumption that credit all of it to science. The first is the impact of science on human life expectancy. Life in the pre-scientific era was not always as short as we commonly imagine it to have been. While life expectancy has risen dramatically in the last century, from 47 to 77 in the United States for the first 2/3 of the scientific era, life expectancy was comparable to that of ancient Rome for those who were not slaves. Anyone familiar with Roman history is well aware that the average life expectancy of 28 years that is commonly cited is misleading. The comparison of life expectancies between one society that practices population control through infanticide, which is factored into the mortality rates, and one that practices it through abortion, which is not a reasonable one. And since both infanticide and slavery were ended by predominantly Christian imperatives, it is improper to inherently credit all evidence of longer human lifespans to science. The second flaw is that advocates for science in all its aspects habitually make use of a different measure depending on whether they wish to credit science for a technological innovation or to deflect blame from it. Consider the previous reference to vaccinations, for example. While vaccines, like massive ordnance air blast bombs, were discovered and developed by scientists making use of the scientific method, scientists no more provide shots to children than they drop bombs on unsuspecting civilian populations. Politicians make the decisions regarding the way vaccines are to be funded and used while doctors and nurses administer them, just as politicians decide if bombs are to be utilized and Air Force pilots deliver them to their targets. One can either argue that science is responsible in both cases based on the involvement of scientage and scientody, or that science is not responsible in either case based on the absence of scientistry. But one cannot logically do is conclude that science is responsible in the one case and not the other. The third flaw is that capitalism and individual freedom arguably play a greater role in technological advancement than all three aspects of science combined. Despite devoting double the percentage of its national expenditures to science than did the United States or any other country in the West, the technologically retarded state of the scientifically enamored former Soviet Union demonstrates that the link between science and technological progress is far more tenuous than is usually considered to be the case. Because there is no hard line between pure science and applied science, aside from the professional distinction between the research scientist and the applications development engineer, it can be difficult to ascertain precisely what responsibility should be assigned to science and the scientist for any given technological innovation. This is especially true when one takes into account the major role that economics and entrepreneurialism also play in technological development. The most prolific and successful inventors are seldom scientists and often are not even engineers. Regardless, it is important to keep in mind that whatever amount of responsibility deserves to be assigned to science, it applies to innovations that are harmful to humanity as well as those that are beneficial. Two famous scientific Richards are in accord on this subject. Quote, "It is that scientific knowledge enables us to do all kinds of things and to make all kinds of things. Of course, if we make good things, it is not only to the credit of science, it is also to the credit of the moral choice which led us to good work. Scientific knowledge is an enabling power to do either good or bad, but it does not carry instructions on how to use it." Richard Feynman. Quote, "People certainly blame science for nuclear weapons and similar horrors. It's been said before, but needs to be said again. If you want to do evil, science provides the most powerful weapons to do evil. But equally, if you want to do good, science puts into your hands the most powerful tools to do so. The trick is to want the right things. Then science will provide you with the most effective methods of achieving them." Richard Dawkins. The Phony War. Science versus Religion. The party cannot be neutral toward religion, because religion is something opposite to science. End quote. Joseph Stalin. When considering the suggested conflict between science and religion, the first and most important is, which science? In the previous chapter, a distinction was made between three aspects of science: scientege, scientistry, and scientody. Of those three aspects, which one can be most reasonably said to pose the greatest threat to humanity? And the second question is, if one or more aspects of science do pose a genuine danger to mankind, then what should we do about it? These questions are not rhetorical, even though they may strike the reader as being more outlandish than the calls for an end to faith to which this book is a response. If one troubles to consider the situation through the broad lens of history, two facts immediately become apparent. 1. There are a lot more religious people than scientists. 2. Religion has never been stamped out anywhere, despite a number of vigorous efforts that lasted for decades. Science and technological development, on the other hand, have been successfully brought to a halt on several occasions in the past. Science is not inevitable. Japan was closed to outside contact from 1639 to 1853, and although the Edo shogunate kept its eye on developments in Rangaku, or Dutch learning, through the international trade permitted at a single port located near Nagasaki, Japanese society did not suffer greatly from its relative backwardness. It certainly suffered far more from its subsequent post-Meiji attempts to catch up to the West, which ended in the second atomic bomb being dropped, ironically enough, on Nagasaki. China, too, successfully arrested its scientific advancement around 1450, transforming itself from the world leader into a distinctly backward nation over a period of 500 years. In short, the end of science is a much more practical goal for humanity than the end of faith. I hope the reader will note that this book is not named The End of Science for a very good reason. I am not anti-science or even anti-scientist, nor am I arguing that the elimination of all science is a moral imperative for humanity. I'm merely following the logic of Sam Harris's Extinction Equation to its proper logical conclusion, which is that if the world truly is in imminent danger, the only reasonable answer is for humanity to put an end to science. But which science? While the body of knowledge certainly contains the danger, since atoms are not given to accidentally colliding and it is difficult to smash one without knowing exactly how to do it, the mere knowledge cannot be said to be the cause of the danger. Scientage itself is static. It is its relationship with scientoti and scientists that makes it dynamic. Knowledge does not give birth to itself. Athena may have appeared on the scene fully armored, but she still had to spring from the brow of Zeus. The method of science, on the other hand, is directly tied to both the theoretical basis for the threats to mankind, as well as the specific applications of the various scientific theories required to develop them into lethal weapons. Hypothesis, experiment, and observation all play integral parts in both the research and engineering aspects of the weapons development process. Without scientoti, these threats to the human race simply would not exist. There is a direct causal relationship between the scientific method and the existence of those things that are, in Harris's words, antithetical to our survival. But not all the new atheists are convinced of an immediate danger to mankind, and they don't even present an entirely unified front regarding the inherent opposition of religion and science. It is interesting to note that it is the least scientific individual who is the most certain that the two are bound to eternal conflict. Christopher Hitchens asserts that all attempts to reconcile faith with science and religion are consigned to failure and ridicule. Sam Harris has created the aforementioned Extinction Equation, of course, and adds that the maintenance of religious dogma always comes at the expense of science. Richard Dawkins is more temperate, but nevertheless admits that he is hostile to religion because it actively debauches the scientific enterprise, subverts science, and saps the intellect. It is only the philosopher Daniel Dennett who argues that the two can conceivably coexist, which is the basis for his call to make a concerned effort to achieve a mutual agreement under which religion, all religion, becomes a proper object of scientific study. What is curious, however, is that once again the primary atheist argument presented is an unscientific and epistemological one that fails to provide any relevant evidence in support of the assertion. I found this curious, as surely this bitter centuries-old conflict must have left some recent signs of the vicious hostilities between the two warring camps. And yet, when I contemplated the matter, it occurred to me that the three most often cited crimes of religion against science are the Catholic Church's persecution of Galileo, the occasional school board battle over teaching evolution in the public schools, and the Christian opposition to the federal funding of research using stem cells taken from human embryos. As one might expect, all three of these issues are brought up in one of the New Atheist books. And yet, these are not serious issues. Taken in their entirety, they barely amount to mild smack talk between unarmed border guards from two neighboring countries caught up in a dispute over agricultural subsidies. To argue that these three things are in any way indicative of an implacable and incorrigible hostility is obviously absurd. Galileo was not attacked because he defended the Copernican theory that had been published 80 years before, but because he was foolish enough to both disobey and publicly caricature his former supporter, Pope Urban VIII, in a book that had been granted both papal permission and inquisitorial authorization. Evolutionary theory is not only taught in the public schools, its teaching is largely unquestioned and unchallenged, a few high-profile cases of stickers on textbooks notwithstanding. As for the stem cell controversy, it is looking increasingly likely as if there simply isn't one. Opposition to federal funding is not inherently religious. Moreover, federal funding is not science and should never be confused with it. Unless scientists are being jailed and put on trial by church authorities for pursuing this morally suspect research, it is a huge exaggeration to claim that the controversy is an example of religion inhibiting science in any way. However desirable it may be, science has no inherent right to the public purse. More importantly, after a decade of stem cell research, no scientist has successfully created a stem cell line using cloned human embryos. But a Japanese researcher at Kyoto University, Shinya Yamanaka, has recently declared that neither human eggs nor human embryos are necessary, since his team has learned how to modify skin cells so that they can be transformed into any type of cell, thus creating a functional technique that provides an easier means of obtaining genetic matches and has the benefit of not engendering either ethical or religious opposition. If this Japanese technique proves successful in humans, one can't help but wonder if the next edition of Letter to a Christian Nation will omit the 5-page screed, 1/18 of the entire book, hysterically condemning American Christians for their obscene opposition to the unnecessary destruction of unborn human children. Harris certainly might wish to revisit his declaration that resistance to embryonic stem cell research is uninformed. It looks as if science would have been poorly served if the Kyoto researchers had accepted the fact about the necessity of destroying 3-day-old human embryos. This hoisting of Harris on his own scientific petard tends to highlight the problem of placing too much trust in science, given the constantly changing nature of the body of knowledge. But stem cells are only a single issue, and since it seemed possible that I might have missed a skirmish or two in this ongoing intellectual struggle, I posed the question of what tangible sins Christianity had committed against science to the readers of my blog, and, arguably more usefully, to the readers of the hitherto mentioned science blog Pharyngula. This was the most comprehensive list, which covered pretty much everything brought up by anyone else. 1. Galileo's trial, 1633 A.D. 2. The demonization of mathematics during the Dark Ages, 476 to 1000 A.D. 3. The persecution of alchemists during the Middle Ages, 476 to 1485 A.D. 4. The execution of Michael Servetus, 1553 A.D. 5. Opposition to the theory of evolution. 6. The destruction of libraries and the burning of books during the 4th and 5th centuries. 7. The ban on the works of René Descartes, 1663 A.D. 8. The imprisonment of Roger Bacon, 1277 A.D. 9. The condemnation of Francis Bacon, 1621 A.D. 10. The destruction of Islamic manuscripts by Cardinal Ximenes, 1499 A.D. 11. The execution of Giordano Bruno, 1600 A.D. 12. The execution of Lucilio Vanini, 1619 A.D. 13. The murder of Hypatia, 415 A.D. 14. The recantation of Comte de Buffon, 1753 A.D. 15. St. Paul's rants against the wisdom of the wise in Corinthians, 1st century A.D. 16. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian's closing of Plato's Academy in Athens, 529 A.D. 17. The ecclesiastical monopoly upon lay education. 18. Martin Luther's attacks upon reason, 1517 A.D. 19. Rejection of modern medicine by the Jehovah's Witnesses and other sects. 20. The excommunication of Johann Kepler by the Catholic Church, 1612 A.D. Now, one can't help but note that the most recent of these terrible sins against science took place more than 250 years ago, in 1753, except for the 3 that still apply today. This is not evidence of an ongoing war. It is merely a collection of historical grudges, most of them remarkably petty. By this standard, Christians would be justified in continuing to hold the Jews liable for the historical crime of murdering their Lord and Savior. Furthermore, 5 of these 7 individual victims of Christian persecution were themselves Christians. No wonder the Unholy Trinity found it difficult to come up with anything more specific than the spurious example of stem cell research. The idea that religion is the enemy of science is a remarkably silly one when examined in scientific terms. Consider that Christian nation and the hostility to science that it supposedly harbors due to its extraordinary religiosity. And yet, the United States of America accounts for more than 1/3 of the global scientific output, despite representing only 4.5% of the global population. The scientific overperformance of religious America is a factor of 7.89, representing 28.7% more scientific output per capita than the most atheistic nation in Europe, France. Ironically, it is easy to provide an example of scientistry sinning against both the scientific method and the body of knowledge much more recent than most of religion's supposed crimes. For example, Ernest Duchesne was a French military doctor who discovered the medical benefits of mold and submitted his doctoral thesis showing the results of his experiments with the therapeutic qualities of bacteria-killing molds to the Institut Pasteur, which ignored it because he was only 23 and had no standing in the scientific community. It would take another 32 years before Alexander Fleming discovered the antibiotic qualities of penicillin. As historian Daniel Boorstin notes in Cleopatra's Nose, the chief lesson of the history of science is that it is not ignorance that menaces scientific advancement, but rather the illusion of knowledge. While the scientific method may lead invariably to a more accurate understanding of the material world, the same is not true of the scientists who pursue it. The profession of science is growing increasingly authoritarian and political, as can be seen by the treatment of those who fail to fall in line with the scientific consensus on subjects where the evidence is far from settled, such as global warming. This poses a real danger to the credibility of all three aspects of science, which is particularly ill-timed in light of the very real danger that science presently poses to humanity. After all, it would be far easier to eliminate a few 100,000 scientists, even a few million scientists, than 4.85 billion religious adherents. Religion does not threaten science so much as science threatens itself. By combining increasingly authoritarian arrogance with an encroachment upon intellectual spheres they are manifestly unprepared to invade, scientists and their thoughtless science fetishist followers risk starting a genuine war they cannot possibly hope to win.